So I think I'd like to start with Scott. If you could just give us a brief overview of contractor oversight issues in FAPIS and all the acronym and acrobat soup, that would be much appreciated. Scott.
We probably don't need these microphones, but I'll put it on anyway so the camera, I guess, picks it up. The project on government oversight has been around since 1981. We started out as the project on military procurement, and eventually back in the mid-90s we switched over and decided to look at the entire federal government. And the old saying is we investigate and expose waste, fraud, and abuse, and then we work with people up here on the Hill and in executive branch agencies to remedy those, to come up with solutions and do our best then to put them forth. What Representative Quigley is talking about is the fact that there's no subcontractor data, and that's one of the problems with the transparency in contracting right now. And so in Afghanistan especially, we're hearing that a lot of private security contractors are hiring Afghan home country nationals to do a lot of their guard service work and support the U.S. efforts and other countries' efforts in supporting our troops and the contractors that are there, in performing both military missions as well as working for the Department of State and USAID. And what they're finding out is a lot of the money that's being given to these subcontractors is actually then being used to, in essence, just pay warlords not to go after their convoys, which then they are taking the next leap in an assumption that that money then is being used then to help fund the war against us. So in essence, it's a great hearing that Tierney, Representative Tierney is actually having today, and so I'm actually glad Representative Quigley was only able to stop in, because I think that's a great place for him to be to ask the right questions. And that's the problem. When it comes to government contracting, there's not a lot of information out there. Who in this room has tried to find an offer or a bid online? Have you been successful? It's very difficult. How about a contract online? Have you been successful in finding it? No, and that's one of the problems. You can get some summary data if you know how to use these databases, and you have the right information going into it, but then even then, you only get a summary of that contract with some coded numbers, some dates, some amounts of money that have been obligated, received, spent, and then you end up with some addresses and phone numbers, and that's about it. And so that's one of the things POGO and Sunlight Foundation and many others in Washington, D.C. are trying to do is let's get all that contract data put online. Let's get the contract put online. Let's stop just assuming what the government is hiring, what goods we're buying, or what services that we're paying for. Let's really get to the meat and potatoes. What are we buying? What are the timelines? What are the performance awards? How are we spending over $500 billion in taxpayer dollars on federal contracts? And then when it comes to subcontract data, there's actually no data. And that's one of the things, because the government doesn't have privity, it doesn't have a link to the subcontractor because it runs through a prime. And in essence, now we're hearing that there's multiple layers of subcontractors out there. There's a first layer, but we're hearing fourth and fifth tier subcontractors out there. The government doesn't have any relationship with those. So for this hearing that's taking place today, it's very difficult for the government to even know who is actually being paid to do the work, and that's problematic. And so one of the ways that we've tried to actually improve the system is we are pushing to get all contracts online. But also in the contractor accountability world, POGO years ago has been pushing for a federal contractor misconduct or responsibility database. And back in 2008, we were able to get a law passed. It was part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2009. President Bush somehow signed it, and so that was wonderful. And now it's trickled down through the regulatory process, and finally the final rule came out, I think it was in March, and the new database is called FAPIS, the Federal Awardee Performance, Integrity, and Information System, FAPIIS. And that database is created to list criminal, civil, and administrative fines and penalties and settlements, suspensions, debarments, contracts terminated for default, for instances that are linked to federal contracts. The problem, though, with that database is it's not publicly available. Who here is from a committee staff. So we have 2, 3, 4. So at that point, you guys may have access to it, because the way that the law is written, it says that access is only provided to the ranking member and the chair. So you guys may want to start poking around FAPUS, but everyone else, other than those 4 staffers, currently won't have access to it without permission from, I think, the OMB administrator. So it may be something you even want to ask about. There was a provision in there to make it publicly available, and it was stripped out. It was stripped out both in the House version and then the Senate version, and there was one staffer that went on record to say, well, you know, we don't need a one-stop shop on all this information combined together, because the fortunate thing for us is a lot of the information in that database is already publicly available. There is certain information that is included in it, performance information, that is considered protected proprietary information, and therefore that is not publicly available in some other databases. But for the most part, the excluded parties list, you can go to epls.gov and see all the contractors who have been or are suspended or debarred. You can go to DOJ or U.S. Attorney pages and find out who's had some kind of civil, criminal, or administrative penalty lodged against them. You can go to OSHA records. You can go to the Department of Labor. There are many, different parts of that database that the information is publicly available. Now, to show you kind of the uphill battle that we're up against is, I sat in on a briefing at the ABA, and the ABA, usually the people that attend that meeting are made up of all the lawyers that represent the contractors, so I'm always not the most popular person at those types of meetings. But they just gave a presentation on FAPUS, dated June 10th, and it says practicalities and industry implementation, and it says other issues to ponder, and it says how to minimize what is reportable. No acknowledgement of fault in the settlement or agreement, and then it goes on and kind of tells you about what to do, with whistleblower actions, prime sub disputes. Mark all FAPUS information proprietary and confidential to strengthen argument that material is exempt from disclosure under FOIA. Well, although I don't have access to the database offhand, I have FOIA'd the database. The database actually went into effect on April 23rd. So on April 23rd, the Project on Government Oversight turned around and sent a Freedom of Information Act request into the GSA, who recently responded and said, well, you also have to go to the Department of Defense and ask for information. And they turned around, so I FOIA'd it. Well, they know, and then Pogo's name was mentioned mentioned during this presentation, that there's an effort to backdoor the information that's not supposed to be publicly available through FOIA. Right after that was mentioned, then they also mentioned the fact that there are many pieces of legislation up here on the Hill that are trying to get FAPUS to be publicly available. And even in the defense authorization, did it make the defense authorization the House version? I don't think so. I think there's some standalone bills that are floating around to make FAPUS publicly available, but the industry seems to not be supportive of that effort. And from what we're hearing, they're putting a lot of pressure on OMB to also oppose making FAPUS publicly available. So it's somewhat at odds with the Open Government Initiative and directive that the Obama administration has put out. Also his stance on FOIA and putting the burden on agencies to not disclose information rather than just hiding it and making information publicly available. So long story short is we're kind of having an uphill battle even with the White House on making this database public. And in an effort to do that, Pogo and 15 other organizations, including Sunlight, just sent up here to the Hill a letter, and it's part of the materials that are listed, and if anybody would like me to email them, a sign-on letter from bipartisan groups asking that a Senate amendment to an appropriations bill make it through conference, and that would make FAPUS publicly available, all but the performance information that has been deemed proprietary. So there are efforts going on to do our best from the outside, but that's where we also need some congressional assistance to help push those things over the top and get them signed into law so that we don't have opposition over at OMB and they're kind of forced to do it. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any specific questions that you have.
Great, thank you so much, Scott.